Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is November of 2018. This is going to be the third entry in a four-part series where I'm covering the left's attempts to map and ultimately attempt to undermine the ways that we are having conversations that get outside of the mainstream media and that oppose far left-wing ideology. In part one, I did a review and point-by-point analysis of Barry Weiss's New York Times article called Meet the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web. Part two was Data and Society's Media Manipulation and Disinformation Online. Part three, this one, will be Alternative Influence, Broadcasting the Reactionary Right on YouTube. And part four will be the Atlantic Council's Whose Truth, Sovereignty, Disinformation, and Winning the Battle of Trust. I will link each one of these below, so that you can check those out in turn. The left has been engaging in this mapping process because they are desperate over the loss of Hillary Clinton in 2016. They're grasping at straws for ways in order to explain that and then to try to undermine that so that they can ultimately make it impossible for 2020. Their goal is to act as gatekeepers and to encourage other people to act as gatekeepers so they can set up the boundaries as to what is sort of acceptable, that being the members of the intellectual dark web, and then those who are not at all acceptable, which will be the ones they map out as having connections to members of the intellectual dark web. Now, several other people have already done their podcasts on this where they've covered the people who were behind these reports and behind these articles, the organizations and individuals, of course, precisely what we would expect, all far-left ideologues and far-left ideological associations. So none of that is any surprise at all. I'm not really going to go into that because I don't really see any point in it. I'm going to cover some aspects of it that I don't think anyone else has actually covered. Just as a quick overview, the rubric that I'm using in order to bracket the understanding of all four of these articles are the concepts of the FBI's COINTEL program, which was revealed many years ago, the way that they would use infiltrators in order to subvert certain movements and then direct them in other ways that were far more radical and perhaps even dangerous. The other would be the CIA's Operation Mockingbird, what some refer to as the Mockingbird Media, where a former head of the CIA admitted that the CIA had agents implanted at all of the mainstream media outlets, both those on television and those in print, which of course attempt to manipulate the thoughts of the people who are exposed to it. The next level would be Cass Sunstein's cognitive infiltration model, where he suggested that it would be good to infiltrate or put people inside of conspiracy theory groups in order to subvert those movements, to, in a sort of vulgar way of phrasing it, to put the turd in the punch bowl, so that you have some kind of outrageous notions associated with something that could be possibly correct or could be headed in the right direction, but their intent is to undermine it by any means necessary. So for part three here, which is solely authored by Rebecca Lewis of Data and Society, it's called Alternative Influence, Broadcasting the Reactionary Right on YouTube. Right out of the gates, we have the, to use their term, problematic use of the word reactionary, which always makes the right look as if it is some sort of unjust incursion upon a left-wing progressivist movement, which can never actually be questioned because it is by definition always and forever correct. It is infallible. It speaks ex cathedra like the Pope. Whatever the left says today is good, true, and just. Whatever it said yesterday or 10 years ago or 50 years ago is now wrong according to current think, because current think always changes day to day. Whoever is correct in left-wing progressivist views today, maybe 5 or 10 minutes from now, will be wrong because they won't be progressive enough, so they'll be cast out. And the intent of this 60 or so page report is to condemn people who talk to other people. It's to condemn people who may be somewhat reasonable, who sometimes speak to other people who may not be so reasonable. What it is trying to do is say that talking to someone who talked to someone else is implicated as bad. And actually, the National Review's editor, Jonah Goldberg, has supported this position before. Recently, he said that because Candace Owens had gone on Alex Jones's InfoWars before, that Fox News should deplatform her and should not have her on as a guest. And of course, by implication, what this means is that anyone that Alex Jones and InfoWars have had on as guests should never be allowed on mainstream television anywhere at all because Jonah Goldberg said so, okay? That would include the likes of Ron Paul, who had been on there many times, Rand Paul, the President of the United States, Donald Trump. That would mean he could never be on Fox News because Jonah Goldberg does not approve of people who go on Alex Jones's InfoWars show. Some of the things that will stand out about this report are the same things that you'll find in all three of the first three reports, not so much in the fourth one. That one was a little bit unique, and it actually has some rather more dangerous implications to the fourth one, which I will point out when we get to that one. But this here follows a similar model to the rest. It uses a not so clever emotional encoding of language. It repeatedly engages in amateur psychologizing, which the left is very fond of, always throwing out various types of phobias and isms and then claiming as if those sorts of things can never be questioned and that they are ultimately in the singular position in order to judge those things and that other people can't judge those things for themselves. So I'll begin here on page 1 with the executive summary. It says, this report identifies and names the Alternative Influence Network, AIN, an assortment of scholars, media pundits, and internet celebrities who use YouTube to promote a range of political positions from mainstream versions of libertarianism and conservatism all the way to overt white nationalism. Now you'll see here that the unstated implication is that these others are possibly, or rather are, covert white nationalism. That is a direct implication that follows from this opening sentence. And immediately, even from this opening sentence, we have a whole mass of contradictions that are not allowed to come out, which would be libertarians and conservatives, of course, have well-known and long-term ongoing conflicts in theory between one another. Within libertarianism, you have a massive number of conflicts. You have 2, 3, or even 4 different varieties, which are always involved in internecine conflict. And the same goes for conservatism. You have all different brands of it where they're always trying to figure out exactly what is the direction that their movements need to go. So this, sort of covers over all kinds of existent conflicts. Another thing that immediately jumps out here is when you look into the people who they're analyzing, you'll find black people, Hispanic people, LGBTQ plus people. You find people all across the spectrum of everything that the left says that it honors and identifies with. They actually all exist within this AIN, but they want to paper over that and then try to tar and feather everyone as being like Richard Spencer, as being, say, white nationalists or white supremacists. This is always the left's go-to move. If you're old enough like me, I'm 41, you'll have seen all this kind of stuff happen before. It happened in the 1990s. They did the same thing when Bill Clinton was in office. They tried to say that everyone who opposed Bill Clinton had to be like, say, Timothy McVeigh or David Duke. David Duke was always their go-to guy back then. They would drag him out at every opportunity, just plaster him all over television, give him literally hundreds of millions of dollars worth of free promotion for his ideas. And of course, his ideas still don't really have very much support anywhere at all. I mean, you can literally count these people in the dozens or hundreds. I mean, they're not a massive movement of hundreds of thousands or millions of people who you have to watch out for. They're really, frankly, a joke. So we go to the next sentence here. Content creators in the AIN claim to provide an alternative media source for news and political commentary. So that's the second sentence, and already we have another major problem. It says content creators in the AIN claim. Well, do they actually provide this? According to your own title, they do. You call them the Alternative Influence Network, so they have to be alternative to the mainstream media, correct? So they don't make this claim. This is an objective fact of the world, but leftists are always very uncomfortable with objective facts of the world. Next sentence. They function as political influencers who adopt the techniques of brand influencers to build audiences and, quote, sell them on far-right ideology. And I would just say here, no, they talk. They talk to people. And how have we already moved into far-right ideology when this person has already admitted that this includes libertarians who don't really have any interest in far-right ideology. I already pointed out to you that they have significant conflicts with one another. And that's just the opening paragraph. And it's something that comes up with leftists over and over and over. They are so completely, utterly incapable of stepping out of their own shoes, of stepping out of their own perspective, that they can't put themselves into the shoes of anyone else and see from the inside their perspective. They can't allow other perspectives to exist at all. They have this eliminationist ideology. They want to eliminate everything that does not abide by whatever their whims of the moment beliefs happen to be. And really, that is what sits at the root of why leftists can't have humor anymore. They can't laugh at things anymore. Nothing can be comical anymore. It's why Saturday Night Live has been absolutely bland and terrible and boring for at least 15 years now. I would say maybe even 20 years. It's just been absolutely dreadful, where you have maybe 4 or 5 segments over all of that time that have been sort of laugh out loud funny. And just to engage for a moment in my own bit of sort of amateur psychologizing, I would say that this lack of ability for the left to laugh at itself, that it takes itself far too seriously right now, is indicative of sort of a subconscious understanding that they're beginning to lose their grip on power. This is something that the Christians and the conservatives and the right wing went through at the end of the 1980s. They had no ability to laugh at themselves. Everything had to be so serious all the time. It always had to be about the book of Revelation, end times eschatology, the end of the world is coming just at any moment and all this sort of stuff. And they had no sense of humor about themselves at all. And this was really a sign that they were about to lose their previously dominant position of power, which took place all throughout the 1990s. But we'll move on here to the next paragraph. It says, this report presents data from approximately 65 political influencers across 81 channels. This network is connected through a dense system of guest appearances, mixing content from a variety of ideologies. This cross-promotion of ideas forms a broader, quote, reactionary position, a general opposition to feminism, social justice, or left-wing politics. And again, I'll point out this presupposes that anything that the left does is always and forever correct, and anything that questions it or pushes back against it is completely wrong. And also, vis-a-vis feminism, I'll have to point out here for the 3rd episode in a row, when they use the blanket term feminism here, when people say feminism is cancer, or I don't like feminism, or I'm not a feminist, what they are talking about is 3rd wave and emergent 4th wave feminism. They are not talking about 1st or 2nd wave feminism for the most part. 1st wave feminism was women should be able to own property like other people. It led to a fuller understanding of female property rights. The other aspect of that was the right to vote, or women's suffrage. Okay, that's 1st wave. 2nd wave went more into sexual liberation, bra burning. It was more about women being able to work outside of the home, to be corporate executives, to start their own businesses, things like that. For the most part, almost no one opposes anything in 1st or 2nd wave feminism. There are some who oppose aspects of that, but it's mostly 3rd and 4th wave feminism, which says things like women need men like fish need a bicycle. It encourages women to be mean to men, to be mean to old men, to be mean to boys, to mistreat them, things like that. This is really an abusive ideology, and it has lots and lots and lots of problems and internal contradictions. And I will continue here. It says, members of the AIN cast themselves as an alternative media system. Okay, so again, we have this same problem again. They cast themselves. Well, either they are or they are not. I don't think I've ever heard any of them cast themselves as anything. They just are what they are. So it says here, cast themselves as an alternative media system by establishing an alternative sense of credibility based on relatability, authenticity, and accountability. So I guess the mainstream media never does any of those things, or at least never verbalizes that it does any of those things. Of course, they try to do these sorts of things. I'm not so much about accountability, though, because they're never accountable for their repeated and incessant lies, which is why you had the development of the alternative media in the first place. Next, it says, cultivating an alternative social identity using the image of a social underdog and countercultural appeal. Well, again, either they have it or they don't have it. Members of the AIN use the proven engagement techniques of brand influencers to spread ideological content, ideological testimonials, political self-branding, search engine optimization, strategic controversy. Now, search engine optimization, which is basically, for those who don't know, the way that you put titles on your videos or whatever it is that you wish people to find, and also you have an option of adding tags below that help to search things that are in the general category of whatever it is that you're trying to talk about. So I guess according to this, you're not supposed to engage in any search engine optimization. You're supposed to just give bizarre, weird titles to your stuff and hope nobody ever finds it or something. I don't know. But really what the author is aiming at with that is trying to tip off Facebook and Twitter and YouTube even more as to figure out ways to suppress this material that this person does not approve of. And with this next section, we're going to move into what really is the ultimate undermining of this entire article itself, its own internal contradiction, as it were. It says here, the AIN as a whole facilitates radicalization through social networking practices. Audiences are able to easily move from mainstream to extreme content through guest appearances and other links. Or they could just get your AIN report right here and find them all where you have them under one roof, right? Political influencers themselves often shift to more radical positions following interactions with other influencers or their own audiences. Not sure how much this is actually supported. That part right there actually makes me think of the not particularly good Ethan Hawke film called First Reformed, which came out recently, which shows a priest being basically radicalized by an environmentalist person to strap bombs to himself. Next section here. When viewers engage with this content, it is framed as lighthearted, entertaining, rebellious, and fun. Well, again, it either is or it isn't. This fundamentally obscures the impact that issues have. Now get this. Listen to the phrasing. This fundamentally obscures the impact that issues have on vulnerable and underrepresented populations. The LGBTQ community, which actually members of the AIN, as I said before, are part of. Women, again, AIN people are women. Immigrants and people of color, and again, AIN is made up of those people as well. And I would also say here, this assumes that the author of this knows everything, that they are omniscient. They're saying basically that no one else is capable of suffering. They are the gods of suffering. They are the ones who know what suffering is, and no one else does. So any of the trials and travails and sacrifices that you or your own family members have made pales in comparison to these other groups who she says are the ones who really know what suffering is. So if you have cancer, if you've lost your house is burned down, someone murdered a member of your family, none of your suffering compares to what she says here is the definition of who knows suffering. And now the paragraph makes a pivot to the suggestions. It says here, the platform needs to not only assess what channels say in their content, but also who they host and what their guests say. So you're not allowed to have people on who this person disapproves of. In a media environment consisting of networked influencers, YouTube must respond with policies that account for influence and amplification, as well as social networks. And again, this means they have to have more and more leftism, or else it isn't acceptable. And on page 3, we move into the introduction. It says here, for a short time on January 4th, 2018, the most popular live-streamed video on YouTube was a broadcast dominated by white nationalists. More specifically, it was a stream by YouTubers Andy Worski and Jean-Francois Gariepi. I've actually never heard of these two guys until this article, facilitating a debate between a white nationalist and a libertarian. The debate topic was scientific racism, which they refer to as race realism, a contemporary incarnation of long-standing claims that there are measurable scientific differences between races of humans. Now, I don't know how many of you know, I've talked about this before. My background is not only in history and philosophy, but also the history of anthropology specifically. So I actually know quite a bit about these various controversial subjects, shall we say. So in this, today, the way it's understood is within physical anthropology and phylogenetics. It also falls into various understandings called population groups. They don't actually refer to people as races or ethnicities within anthropology itself. It goes into what is called cladistics, where human population groups are measured on clades and clines, how they sort of meld and blend from one into the other. And really what they find is you don't really have these what are called essentialist separated categories, like you have white dude A over there, black guy B over there, C, so on and so forth, the way that they used to break down the races in the 1800s. Like if you picked up a text back then, they would have these categorical separations of people, which in anthropology today, they refer to that mostly as the social construction of race, and they do sometimes refer to it by this concept of race realism or scientific racism and all of that. These are ongoing debates. But what has come out of bioanthropology and physical anthropology, when they look into the physiognomy of the cranial shape of the heads, the size and shape of the cranium and all of these sorts of things, what they find is you have blends that take place. There's sort of a flow that takes place between the groups because they haven't been separated enough, according to the theory, to where these are distinct species or anything like that. Since they can mate, they're obviously not separated in that fashion. And a lot of this relates back to various theories about how these so-called races or ethnicities originally formed, where it happened, and when it happened. So the dominant theory is called the out of Africa 1 hypothesis. This is the one that you're probably familiar with, the African Eve theory, that humans left Africa, 200 to 300,000 years ago, spread out into Europe and Asia, and then they developed modifications to those various geographical environments over time. And this is one that leads into a theory regarding quote-unquote races that say that they evolve or develop and change rather rapidly, say over periods of 5,000 years, 8,000, 10,000, even 50,000 years, because those time frames within anthropology really are not all that big. They're sort of a blink of an eye in change terms. Now, the conflicting theory that's actually a rather larger controversy within anthropology that most people don't know about outside of anthropology is called the out of Africa 2 hypothesis, or the multi-regional hypothesis. The first one is advanced by Christopher Stringer. He's the one who you usually see on the television documentaries about this debate. And the other one is led by Milford Wolpoff, who I believe today is at the University of Michigan. Wolpoff's version of this theory is that what led to humans, the population groups that left Africa, actually took place not 200 to 300,000 years ago, but actually around 2 million years ago. And this gets into a lot of analysis of mitochondrial DNA, the Y chromosomes, showing that basically the modern form of Homo sapiens sapiens that we know of today left Africa around 100,000 years ago, but then melded with or mixed with other pre-existing human groups who were already outside of Africa, which left all kinds of other genetic markers in our genes that can be tested for today and found. And Dr. Wolpoff is a paleoanthropologist, and he's mainly rooted in physical anthropology. And the reason he came up with his argument is that he says his theory closely matches the physical evidence that's actually found in the field. What he says is that Christopher Stringer's version of the theory is one that has far too many contradictions with evidence that's found primarily in Asia, but also some things that they found in the Middle East and in Europe. I can't go into all of the issues related to that right now, but I'll link some of the stuff below so you can check it out. But I really recommend you get Milford Wolpoff and Rachel Kaspari's book called Race and Human Evolution, where he's able to lay out his various theories about that and why I think that it is a theory that should be taken more seriously. But the fact that these debates exist within anthropology, and then the outcome of it is that anthropologists will make the statements to, their students and to the public at large that there is no such thing as race. And this has a big problem, of course, not only for the political right, but for the political left as well, because the political left says that all kinds of other races are discriminated against by white people. But then, it begs the question, well, what is race? What is it that you're referring to if the anthropologists reliably tell us that there is no such thing as this concept of race, that it's basically a socially constructed concept? So this has understandably made anthropologists really skittish around using the terms for race or ethnicity. Really, the closest thing you'll find to it today is when you look into things about paleoanthropology, and they're looking at the very ancient remains of certain discoveries, and maybe from time to time they'll refer to them as Caucasoidal or Africoid or something like that, but it just really means that it fits into some loose grouping as basically what they understand in phylogeny studies and cladistic studies as population groups. But back to the article here, it continues. Arguing in favor of scientific racism was infamous white nationalist Richard Spencer, who is basically becoming the stand-in for David Duke now, since Duke has sort of gone to the wayside. Every once in a while he'll pop up in order to endorse somebody and create a bunch of controversy. Known for having popularized the term alt-right. Ostensibly on the other side was Carl Benjamin, and you'll notice that they always like to use the real-world name of these people rather than their online identities. A YouTuber who goes by the pseudonym Sargon of Akkad. Now, I know already that Sargon never agreed with Spencer on any of these things related to race matters, so I don't know why it says ostensibly on the other side. He was objectively on the other side, and he's clarified that even since then. During the broadcast, the debate became the #1 trending live video worldwide on YouTube, with over 10,000 active viewers. The archived version of the broadcast has been viewed an additional 475,000 times. And so what your point is? I'll skip the next paragraph where basically she's complaining about comments under the video. It says here, this debate is part of a larger phenomenon in which YouTubers attempt to reach young audiences by broadcasting far-right ideas in the form of news and entertainment. And again, this is essentially just boiled down to saying that if you don't say what leftists say, then you shan't be able to be heard in public. It continues here, while many of their views differ significantly, they all share a fundamental contempt for progressive politics, specifically for contemporary social justice movements. For this reason, I consider the collective position reactionary. And she acts as if this is, some new discovery, like this is a term that she's coined or something. But the left has been using this for decades in order to sort of slander anyone who opposes anything that they propose. I consider their collective position reactionary as it is defined by their opposition to visions of social progress. And I question the use of the term visions here. Whose visions? Why does only the left get to set that agenda for what the vision is of social progress? Why is no one else allowed to have a vision of social progress? United in this standpoint, these YouTubers frequently collaborate with and appear with others across ideological lines. Oh, forbid that they should ever talk to one another. Together, they have created a fully functioning media system that I call the Alternative Influence Network. See, once again, I have to point out here that the left looks at YouTube and thinks that's supposed to be for cat videos. They look at Facebook and they're like, well, that should be for connections with family, friends, coworkers, and to generate hookups from people who you went to high school with. The content creators in the AIN claim to provide an alternative media source for viewers to obtain news and political commentary. Again, here I'll point out to you that she just says that they claim to provide, but she just actually named them the Alternative Influence Network. So either they claim to provide it or they actually objectively do provide it. And political commentary outside of legacy news outlets such as cable channels and print media. And this is one of the terms that I really don't like, is referring to the mainstream media or MSM as legacy news. I think that is far too elegant of a term than what they deserve. A legacy is something that is honorable, beautiful, wonderful that you leave behind for others, for them to honor and cherish. The so-called legacy news, or MSM, does no such thing whatsoever. They are egregious in their failings of the public. With this positioning, they are capitalizing on a changing news and information environment. YouTube has become a crucial site for broadcasting political and news-related content. A 2018 Pew Research Center report found that 73% of U.S. adults visit YouTube. For what reason? Do you notice the pivot there? It didn't say that they were coming there for cat videos or for news videos, with the percentage rising to 94% for 18 to 24-year-olds. As of 2017, YouTube fell behind only Facebook as the social network most popular for viewing news stories. Simultaneously, trust in mainstream media outlets is continually in decline. It should be, with only 32% of Americans claiming to trust the media in a 2016 Gallup poll. I can't really imagine why anyone would trust the mainstream media anymore, as many lies as they have told and tell essentially on a daily basis, hundreds, perhaps thousands. And I would say here too, to the author, be honest. Don't be hacks for one party, which is the biggest problem with the media. In the next paragraph, the author goes on to complain about how people are able to make money from various sources through their use of YouTube. I say more power to them, but she seems to not be very pleased with that situation. Because of their high visibility and marketing potential within communities on social platforms, some content creators become influencers in their communities, people who shape public opinion and advertise goods and services through the, quote, conscientious calibration of their online personae. Now, I don't know why conscientious calibration is put in scare quotes, but it is. It makes no sense. As I said before, most of these people just get on and talk, and they talk around the mainstream media. The next portion here goes on to say, influencers often develop highly intimate and transparent relationships with their audiences and then, quote, capitalize on their followers by inserting advertisements for products and services, end quote, into their lifestyle content. Now, Bill still does some of that, but I don't think too many people who go to his site are perturbed by it. Actually, most people sit through the initial advertisement and then go on to watch what he has to say afterwards. While the individuals of the AIN are not generally selling goods or services, they adopt the techniques of influencers to build audiences and, quote, sell them on far-right ideology. Again, here I have a question about this. How have we made this transition from libertarianism and mainstream conservatism to so-called far-right ideology? Repeatedly, the author of this document makes these leaps, these inferences, without any credible support. On page 5, it goes on to say here, digital media scholar Crystal Abaddon has noted that celebrity and influencer culture is often ascribed a presumed, quote, frivolity that leads to its underestimation among academics and journalists. The frivolity is in scare quotes, once again, I don't know why, and the use of the term underestimation is basically something that falls in line with combat enemy language. In other words, they are targeting them as potential combatants in the info wars. However, she argues that online celebrities can often convey deceptively subversive and powerful messages. And you'll recall here that the left typically puts itself up as that which is subversive of the so-called dominant or mainstream culture, but this is very indicative that the left is starting to realize and have to admit that it has become the dominant culture, which is being subverted right now. And I move down a bit more in the same paragraph where it says, instead, it requires us to scrutinize polished, well-lit micro-celebrities and the captivating videos that are easily available on the pages of the internet's most popular video platform. Now, this portion here where it says well-lit, that is very strange. I don't know what that has to do with anything. In fact, Fox Day often broadcasts from a dark room in what he calls the dark stream. And very often you'll see Jordan Peterson also broadcasting from a dark room where there's only the light of the computer monitor on his face. So I'm not sure what this well-lit micro-celebrities has to do with anything at all either. The next paragraph is rather mind-boggling in its level of daftness. Influence is not created in a vacuum. It occurs within and propagates through social networks. Part of the way influencers build followings is by becoming, quote, nodes around which other networks of opinions and influencers cluster, end quote. One of the most effective ways to network on YouTube is by referencing and including other people in video content. In fact, how-to manuals for building influence on YouTube often list collaborations as one of the most effective strategies. These guides suggest guest appearances, guest hosts, and collaborative appearances as strategies for content creators to grow exposure and multiply audiences. Well, doesn't that sound a lot to you like late night talk shows? Isn't that what they've been doing for 50 years or more? I'm not sure why suddenly it's evil if people on YouTube do so. And on page 6 at the top it says, these practices include ideological testimonials, political self-branding, search engine optimization, and the strategic use of controversy. And this really raises a question for me in terms of the social networking aspect. If one did not participate in such things, then they would just be discredited as a lone wolf or an isolated kook. They would be said to be forming into the next Unabomber. This was a technique that people such as this on the left used all throughout the 1990s, and it was a very effective model for silencing people because it was very difficult to make contacts with others except through the mail and through various advertisements in the backs of kind of shady magazines. And then the author moves on to get to the real point that's being made. It says, finally, I conclude by considering what steps could be taken to temper the harmful political effects of the AIN. Specifically, I argue that YouTube should reassess both their monetization incentive programs and their content moderation practices. In other words, they should expand the scope of their targeting and ban even more people and shadow ban as many as possible. Under the next section called Methods, to understand the AIN in depth, I analyzed both the content of YouTube influencers, that is, what they are saying, as well as their collaborations, who they are broadcasting with. The latter presented a significant research challenge, as YouTube does not provide metadata about guest appearances. I take this as a not-so-subtle hint from Data and Society that the next time they're doing one of these investigations, YouTube needs to get with a program and hand over their metadata to them. And on page 8, it begins with the Alternative Influence Network. The Alternative Influence Network is a coherent discursive system despite the seeming variety and independence of its members. So, seeming variety here. In this section, I show how these figures are connected by an interlocking series of videos, references, and guest appearances. Within the AIN, a hodgepodge of internet celebrities claiming a variety of political positions impart their ideologies to viewers and each other, again, claiming. The boundaries between different political groups of influencers and the ideological positions they promote are often slippery. Many identify themselves primarily as libertarians or conservatives. Others self-advertise as white nationalists. At least she left out white supremacists on this one. Simultaneously, these influencers often connect with one another across ideological lines. At times, influencers collaborate to the point that ideological differences become impossible to take at face value. That's her opinion, of course. For example, self-identified conservatives may disavow far-right extremism while also hosting explicit white nationalists on their channels. Well, Larry King has had a number of very controversial guests over the years. Are we to think that he endorses every single bad idea all of his guests have? Was that true of Arsenio Hall or Johnny Carson or anyone else in the past who hosted people on their show? I don't think so. Within the AIN, this collaboration generates a cross-promotion of ideas that forms a broader intertextual common ground. Many of these YouTubers are less defined by any single ideology than they are by a, quote, reactionary position, a general opposition to feminism, note as I pointed out before, third and fourth wave feminism, not first or second so much, social justice, or left-wing politics. But does this not raise another question here? I mean, how did far left-wing progressivism arise in the first place if it was not a reaction to the already pre-existing dominant traditional cultures? So by definition, wouldn't far left progressivism actually be reactionary? And on page 9, we really start to get into the absurdities of how to connect and link people to other people. Among the 80-plus channels I cataloged for this research, I found a highly connected network of influencers across numerous ideological positions. The network includes media pundits with mainstream appeal, such as Jordan Peterson, a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto with a best-selling self-help book. It also includes self-identified white nationalists such as Richard Spencer. While Peterson and Spencer have never collaborated directly, they have both collaborated with the same influencer, Carl Benjamin, aka Sargon of Akkad. And does this not make you wonder, okay, so Larry King never directly collaborated with Charles Manson, but he has also interviewed Geraldo Rivera, who did interview Charles Manson. Larry King also interviewed numerous members of the Manson family, the Manson cult. Does that mean then that Larry King is connected to the Manson murders? This is very bizarre way to create connections out of thin air. In the introduction, I described Benjamin's debate with Spencer on scientific racism, which took place in January 2018. In a live stream video from less than a year before, in April 2017, Peterson and Benjamin have a friendly conversation in which they promote gender traditionalism, deny the existence of a gender pay gap. That's actually not true. There are all kinds of explanations for the pay gap that does exist, and claim that IQ is the highest predictor of success. Indeed, it is. This is rather unquestioned in the field that studies that related to psychometrics within psychology. At the bottom of this page, it has a reference to Figure 1, which highlights how tightly connected influencers in the AIN are. Each link represents at least one collaboration between two influencers. In other words, one or more instances in which one appeared in a video with another. The visualization showcases the extent to which they create a broader, highly connected symbiotic media system. Or just a media system, perhaps? And also, I wonder if this author is aware that Barbara Walters actually interviewed both Bill Cosby and Bill Clinton. So then does that mean that they are connected, especially both have been accused of rape? So is Barbara Walters connected to rape? And on the next page, it has the now rather infamous illustration, which I will put up so that you can look at it if you're watching this at home or whatever. And the first thing that jumps out to me is there are several people on here who I've never heard of, several I've never watched at all. I watch regularly, maybe 1/5 or 1/6 of the people on this page. But does that then mean that I am connected to them or connected to these problems with white nationalism and all of these other issues that the author is so concerned about? Very confusing. On page 11, it becomes even more absurd when we find here that it says AIN network paths. Network path 1 illustrates how the, quote, classical liberal Dave Rubin and the white nationalist Colin Robertson millennial woes are only separated by 2 degrees through the anti-feminist Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, who has appeared on both of their channels. Now, this is some seriously messed up 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon stuff going on here. So, my sister was at a charity event where they were participating in raising money for children, where Kevin Bacon actually was. He was part of this event. So does this mean that I am 1 degree separated from Kevin Bacon? Does that mean that I was in Footloose because my sister was close to Kevin Bacon? And back in 1992, when Arnold Schwarzenegger was the head of the President's Council on Physical Fitness, he had an event where he came fairly close to where I live, and my dad was actually part of Arnold's security detail during these events. So does this mean that I was in Terminator 2 or Total Recall? Am I directly linked to Arnold Schwarzenegger because of this? This is totally absurd. At times, going through this report, it's almost like going through some kind of an ancient, late medieval manuscript that's dealing with alchemy. It's sort of an alchemy of links and connections of this person to another person. With the next section on page 12, we get to the reason that I started with the IDW, or Intellectual Dark Web, article from the New York Times with Barry Weiss, before coming to this one about the AIN. To understand the importance of links in this graph, consider the role that Dave Rubin plays. Rubin is a comedian turned pundit who hosts a YouTube talk show called The Rubin Report. I think it would also be important for her to point out here that he is gay and he's married to a man. But conveniently, for left-wing political purposes, that is strategically left out, which has over 750,000 channel subscribers. Rubin describes himself as a classical liberal, a variation on a libertarian embrace of small government and individual liberty. Yes, it's a very well-established concept within political science and philosophy both. As the host of a number of public intellectuals and influencers, Rubin has become a focal point in a community that calls itself the intellectual dark web. Rubin describes this group not in terms of ideology, but rather as an eclectic mix of people devoted to having the important and often dangerous conversations that are completely ignored by the mainstream. True. His most frequent guests are the other self-identified members of the IDW, including the psychology professor Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, conservative media pundit. However, Rubin also hosts a range of influencers outside of this sub-community, including those with more openly extremist views. These guests include Stefan Molyneux, a talk show host who promotes scientific racism. No, Molyneux is a philosopher, and he does not promote scientific racism. He has interviews with the top IQ researchers in the world, most of whom are on the political left. Okay, that would be the truth. And Lauren Southern, a Canadian citizen journalist who has since been barred from entering England because of her vehement anti-Islam and anti-immigration activism. I think that Lauren's work speaks for itself, and she has now turned to becoming a documentarian, and quite a good one. Rubin has also hosted Carl Benjamin, himself a heavily connected node of the AIN. Benjamin first made content in the early 2010s, focusing on criticizing feminist game critics and feminism more broadly. He grew his popularity in 2014 by broadcasting throughout Gamergate, a movement of coordinated harassment against women, game critics, and designers. No mention here, of course, that these female game critics and the designers and so on were sleeping with one another so that they would publish positive reviews of really awful games in game magazines and deceive the gaming public. And that is just one tiny fraction of the problems that were going on in Gamergate. Since then, he has continued to grow his following with more anti-feminist, anti-social justice content. His main channel now has over 800,000 subscribers, and a secondary channel has an additional 250,000. Benjamin calls himself a skeptic, a term originally used to refer to a group of YouTube atheists. No, skeptic was originally used by Skeptic magazine, which has been around since at least the 1970s or so, and refers to critics of the paranormal who criticize, say, UFO sightings or Bigfoot sightings and things of that nature. Later, it came to be applied to the new atheist, one of whom has been recycled into the IDW, and that is Sam Harris. Moving down a bit here, at the same time, Benjamin frequently collaborates with openly white nationalist YouTubers. Again, was Geraldo collaborating with Charles Manson when he did the interview? In his video with Spencer, Benjamin was presumably debating against scientific racism, a stance he frequently echoes. No, he actually did debate against him, and they never came to agreement. However, by participating in the debate, he was building a shared audience. No, he wasn't. And thus a symbiotic relationship. Well, did Leslie Stahl form a symbiotic relationship? Was she collaborating when she interviewed Vladimir Putin? This is completely ridiculous. So I skip over here to page 13, where the author is quoting Sargon in reference to an interview that he had with Millennial Woes, where he said, "In many ways, we do have similar objectives. We have the same enemies, right? I mean, you guys hate the SJWs. I hate the SJWs. Well, this is just the classic position of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? I want to see the complete destruction of social justice." He's meaning social justice warriorism, the idea, the concept. If the alt-right took the place of the SJWs, I would have a lot less to fear. Then it ends the quotation there to make you afraid, to scare you. But really, what he's trying to say here is that the objectives of the left are completely totalitarian. And if one could attain the destruction of SJWism as a mindset, then the right would clearly become the new enemy. I mean, this is how you make short-term political allegiances or alliances in order to team up against a much larger and more threatening enemy. And then later, those two subgroups would then become enemies down the road. It's obvious. On page 15, we find the beginning of chapter 2 called Building an Alternative Media. Across the AIN, influencers express a distrust of the, quote, mainstream news media and a desire to use YouTube to create a better alternative media system. Well, did this very same report not already admit that only 32% of people who are apparently numbskulls actually trust the mainstream media? I think that was in here already, so yes. In some cases, they refer to themselves collectively as the alternative media. This positioning may seem counterintuitive, as much of their content, from educational videos to live-streamed, quote, hangouts to personal vlogs, bears little resemblance to the traditional format of news media. Sure, I mean, what are people supposed to do? Come up with $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 to build their own media room in their home or in a garage, in a basement? I mean, I'm not sure what the implication of this sentence is. For the influencers in the AIN, distrust of the mainstream media often turns to outright rejection and hostility. Various influencers decry what they feel is a liberal, progressive, or SJW bias in the mainstream. No, it is not a feeling. It is a fact. It's objective, and you can check the stats on it. I've covered that before in my show. They, across the board, lean far left. News and media departments often donate 90+% to the Democratic Party. Same goes for university professors. Others point to cases of journalistic failure, i.e., lying on behalf of governmental power structures, and corporate power structures as well, I would point out, and the economic challenges faced by media in digital environments. Well, the economic challenges are that you are not providing value, and so people don't give you anything back in exchange for it. But this is also why you'll often hear leftists say that, well, we need to tax the people so that we can then pay for a media service outside of the corporate structured media services. But that would basically just be a glorified version of PBS or NPR, which is sort of what the BBC is, basically. Another propaganda outlet for the left. Some employ anti-establishment reasoning to reject the corporate logics driving many mainstream outlets. What is anti-establishment reasoning? I'd like to read a book on that to find out exactly what that is. By creating an alternative media system on YouTube, influencers in the AIN express a wish not only to provide an additional alternative option for young audiences, but also to replace their consumption of mainstream news entirely. Well, most young people don't watch the news at all unless they have to. To do so, they can capitalize on the broader distrust of news media in the American population. Indeed, among American audiences, only 14% of Republicans have, quote, a great deal or, quote, a fair amount of trust in the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. Sure, and I would guess those 14% are probably neocons, probably the David Frums and Bill Kristols of the world. And again, as I would have you note here, the extreme level of a lack of self-awareness, it says here, in an extensive study on the online news sharing ecosystem in the lead up to the 2016 U.S. presidential election, researchers found that conservatives were opting out of media sources traditionally considered mainstream, such as the New York Times, and were instead sharing news from a range of hyper-partisan websites such as Breitbart News. So there's a complete, utter lack of ability to see the blatant leftism of the New York Times. I mean, this is simply stunning. It's staggering. It should knock you backwards that this person doesn't understand that the New York Times is merely the big, more heavily funded version of Breitbart for the left. That's all it is. Same as the Washington Post, Bezos' blog. The other one is Carlos Slim's blog. We continue here. The following sections outline two key ways the influencers in the AIN differentiate themselves from mainstream news as a way to appeal to young, disillusioned media consumers. The first way is by rejecting traditional news media norms for building credibility and trust. Well, since you've already reported that the credibility and trust level is about 32%, Let's say that you took a test when you were in school and you got back a 32 on it. Would that mean that you're doing a good job or a really, really poor job? So of course they're rejecting the traditional news media norms because these norms are failures. And the gist of this section here is all about boundary policing and setting up more and more parameters for banning people that the left does not like. These influencers explicitly reject the trappings of institutional prestige. Well, those are largely wasted on telling lies to people over and over. Adherence to objectivity and neutrality. Well, I would suggest that you read a book by a historian called That Noble Dream, The Objectivity Question in the American Historical Profession, and you'll find out that in history it's a really big problem, and it's far worse in the mainstream news media. And the enforcement of gatekeeping mechanisms that dominate mainstream news media. Instead, they build trust with their audiences by stressing their relatability, their authenticity, and their accountability to those audiences. I mean, God forbid they be accountable to their audiences, right? I mean, who would ever be authentic? I mean, we need to be robots, I suppose, out here and act just like the boring, bland, idiot morons that you watch on television from time to time accidentally if you're walking through an airport and you get CNN forced on you. Because that's the real problem with these is these news media outlets prefer to talk down to you. They prefer to talk to you as if you're an imbecile and you can't tell the difference between what is true and what is not. The second way is by providing a specific social identity for themselves and their audiences. Specifically, they provide a like-minded community for those who feel like social underdogs. Well, do they really just feel this way, or is that actually the case? I mean, that's the real question that you need to get to, really. Social underdogs for their rejection of progressive values, and they provide a sense of countercultural rebellion for those same audiences. See, we get a sense of and feel like, I would like to ask the audience a question now. I mean, do you think that SJWs strike you as people who are coolly calculating and rational people, or do you see them screaming and throwing things and setting fires and breaking windows and cracking people over the head with bike locks and clawing on the doors of the Supreme Court? All of this insanity that we've watched now for 2 years. And I move down here to the next paragraph towards the bottom. It says, the AIN influencers also draw from the practices of news outlets like Fox News, which has for many years cultivated an oppositional social identity against the cultural elites of liberal media, even as it remains the most popular cable news outlet. Well, that would be because it doesn't have any other competitors who do what they do. It's popular because it offers a non-left outlet away from PBS, BBC, NPR, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, and every single late-night talk show and Saturday Night Live. They're all like watching the same thing over and over and over on every channel. And this trend actually started under the George W. Bush regime when people started to get their news from Comedy Central, mainly from Jon Stewart and then later from Stephen Colbert. And that was the time when those people were actually funny, and now they're just like watching CNN. They're no different. Of course, Jon Stewart got in and made his 100 mil or so and then stepped out, and now he's regarded as this sort of wizened old doyen of knowledge, that the mainstream media will go to every once in a while to interview. And let's see what John has to say about this, a guy who literally was an absolute nobody until George Bush came along, and then people were just, craving for anybody to take shots at Bush because Bush was objectively terrible, just as Obama was objectively terrible. The next section here is called Alternative Credibility. Many influencers in the AIN discuss their channels as new kinds of, quote, experiments. Well, I can tell you right now that 60 episodes or so in, for me, it does feel very experimental. I still don't really know what I'm doing, but I am trying. In relaying information in more meaningful and accurate ways than legacy media. Now, I really detest this term legacy media. Legacy implies that you've left something behind that's honorable and something to be regarded positively. It's something that other people should look up to in order to emulate and all of that. And I don't think that is the case at all with our MSM. Specifically, this means they largely reject traditional modes of news media credibility, such as institutional reputation. Well, if they've tarred and feathered their own institutional reputation, then why should people regard it positively, correct? And the ideal of objectivity, and we already know that since they're all far leftists, they don't do anything near this ideal of so-called objectivity. Over on page 17, we have the next category called relatability. Legacy media, quote, draws on the long-standing familiarity and reputation of their brand. As a source of trust, outlets such as the New York Times and the Washington Post have built credibility and trust over the course of decades. Of course, this is credibility and trust with far left-wing professors at the universities, and then, of course, their students who are members of the media later. I'm not sure who else finds them credible other than people like perhaps Bill Kristol. Down in the next paragraph, we find, rather than stressing institutional credibility, political influencers highlight how relatable and accessible they are to their audiences. Indeed, as social media scholar Brooke Aaron Duffy describes, across communities on YouTube, influencers often highlight their relatability and disavow, quote, traditional markers of status by casting themselves as people, quote, just like us, end quotes. Well, what else would they present themselves as? This is completely baffling once again. Political influencers treat it as a point of pride to not be affiliated with larger legacy news institutions. In fact, some influencers, including Tim Pool, often discuss their departures from media and academic institutions to highlight their outsider status as a source of credibility. Poole previously worked at Vice Media and Fusion TV before striking out on his own. Well, good for Tim. I mean, Tim has done some very good reporting, and he self-admittedly is on the political left, but I've seen him broadcasting from events basically all over the Western world, revealing what's actually going on inside of various movements. And if we had some real institutions out there who gave out awards for news reporting, Tim would definitely be one of the people who would get one. Perhaps that's what the alternative media needs to do to sort of build their own internal credibility, is start giving out their own awards for good work that people do. In this next paragraph on page 18, we get into what I think is basically a proxy battle for the Koch brothers against George Soros. It says here, however, this framing obscures his partnership, this is talking about Dave Rubin, by the way, with a well-funded, highly influential libertarian organization, which provides him with many of the speakers who appear on his show. In 2016, he established a partnership with Learn Liberty, an initiative housed in the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS, at George Mason University. George Mason indeed does have a number of quite good libertarians and economists as well. The IHS is heavily funded by the billionaire Koch family and is chaired by Charles Koch. Its specific aim is to cultivate and subsidize a farm team of the next generation's libertarian scholars. I don't really have a problem with any of that. Thus, Rubin is able to position himself as a, quote, free thinker and an outsider, even as he is promoted by a well-funded organization with the explicit aim of promoting libertarian ideals on behalf of wealthy donors. Well, this report here that I'm reading from is indeed funded by George Soros's Open Society and a whole conglomerate of other millionaires and billionaire societies that are all on the far political left. And the Kochs, by the way, are not particularly libertarian. They have kind of a messy reputation, shall we say, among libertarians, as certainly libertarians of the bent that I come from, by the way. Maybe we should just arrange some kind of a MMA battle between Charles Koch and George Soros, and then we'll let that decide who's the winner of this semi-libertarian aspect versus the socialists. Under the next section called Authenticity, we find here another completely baffling and ludicrous phrasing of sentence here. Influencers in the AIN instead adopt the strategies of micro-celebrities, particularly the cultivation of authenticity through transparency and responsiveness. Now, why should these be problematic categories of action and behavior? I mean, are these things not what people would prefer to have? And over on page 19, we find this in the second paragraph from the top. Detached from the cable news cycle, the content on YouTube also takes on a different temporal rhythm from the mainstream news. As media scholars have noted for decades, the television format often encourages shortened, simplified sound bites that obscure the nuances of topics in the news. Well, yeah, that's because they're there simply to deliver you to advertisers. They're not there to deliver neutral and objective factual information to you, except when they're giving out sports scores or whatever the weather's going to be, things like that. As soon as they move over into politics, it's all pure bias and nothing else. In the next paragraph we have here, as social media scholars have noted, the very idea of cultivating authenticity is itself a contradiction. Very interesting there. Authenticity has become such an effective way of building influence that powerful media institutions, both progressive and conservative, have begun to take notice. Recently, it has become a key topic at conservative media conferences like Right Online, also funded by the Koch brothers. The goal of the event is to teach a new generation of media makers how to build influence and spread conservatism. Well, the Kochs, as I said before, are not particularly conservative at all, and they're not very good at being libertarians either, as I also pointed out. Attendees can find presentations and panels specifically on the topics of being authentic and being likable, as well as establishing a clear media persona and a story about oneself. Well, I guess that is preferable to somebody, say, chewing tobacco and spitting on the floor or something like that. I don't know, maybe some people would like that approach as well. No one's tried it as far as I know. Under the next category of accountability, the AIN engages directly with its audiences in a way that traditional news outlets do not, through comments and social media posts, but also directly in video content. Traditionally, legacy media outlets have used gatekeeping mechanisms and a level of distance from their audience as a way to establish expertise and authority. They like to hold a captive audience and they like to speak down to them. They like to speak at them, and that model of approach is ultimately dying off because people do not like to be treated that way. They don't like to be treated as if they are children when they are adults. Over on page 20, under alternative social identity, we find here, media scholars have argued that information consumption is less about factually correct or incorrect information than it is about rallying around a collective social identity. Well, sure, this just appeals to the basic human instincts towards tribalism. It's natural and it's normal. It's just simply what happens. Media scholar Daniel Kreis, for example, argues that Fox News and Breitbart News, their big bad enemies there, have been so successful in part because they provide a metaphorical, quote, family to those who reject mainstream news. This is powerful from a political perspective because a family provides, quote, a sense of identity, place and belonging, emotional, social, and cultural support and security, and gives rise to political and social affiliations and beliefs. Well, sure, yeah, this is true all the way across the political spectrum. Are they saying that left-wing progressivist virtue signaling doesn't provide to them that sense of family as well? They're sort of tribal in-group preferences. It's the same thing. One side does it, the other side does it as well. A couple of pages over, on 22, we find at the top, a similar sentiment has been circulated by James Damore, sometimes laughably referred to as the Google Bro. Now, James, if any of you have seen him, is one of the most socially awkward human beings I have ever seen in my life. He is the farthest thing from a Google Bro that you could ever imagine. But he does seem to be quite a nice fellow. The Google engineer, who was fired in July 2017 after sharing a memo promoting biologically determinist misogyny as an explanation for gender disparities within the company. Well, no, really what he was doing was he proposed a mere possibility on a memo board that was meant just for such things, And basically what he was giving out were scientific generalities. It was not strict biodeterminism by any measure. At the bottom of this paragraph, it goes on to say, while many in the AIN criticize and mock progressive social movements for what they see as a victim mentality, they also simultaneously position themselves as the genuine victims in society. When every single university, every single mainstream media source, every movie, every television show, every commercial obsessively crams social justice warrior madness down everyone's throats, there's a tendency for a certain percentage of the population to reject that and to be quite upset about that taking place. Over on page 23, we find a sentence here that says, while the members of the AIN espouse drastically different political views than either of the countercultures they draw from, she's referring here to that of the 60s and the punk rock scene of the 1980s, they use their avowed populism to align with the anti-establishment sentiment of both past movements. Well, sure, because the left is the capital E establishment now, as has already been admitted earlier in this very same document, where she said that they were subversive on YouTube. Over on page 24, we find yet another rank absurdity. It says here, influencers in the AIN often bully and make fun of other influencers they disagree with, and sometimes encourage their viewers to do the same. This is not at all the same as using the power of law to discriminate against other people the way that the left prefers to do now. This is not at all the same as using corporate power to have people like the so-called Google bro fired, or corporate power to ban people all across the different varieties of social media that are available right now. That is entirely different than calling someone a name that they don't like to be called. The concluding paragraph here, the final sentence says, in this way, they can paradoxically align hyper-traditional ideals with the rebellious positioning of past countercultural movements. Well, I say here that it is paradoxical to you because you adhere to obsessive far-left ideology. The anxiety that is being felt by you because your side's grip on power is slowly slipping away all across the Western world right now. So when they project out this idea saying that it is the right, that it's white males and so on who are feeling this anxiety, this is sort of indicative of the anxiety that the left is actually experiencing right now. That is just my amateur psychologizing bit there, since they engage in it. I mean, why can I not engage in the same, right? On page 25, we have the third chapter, which is promoting ideology through influencer marketing. And towards the bottom under ideological testimonials, it says here, one popular testimonial trope among right-wing political influencers is the transformation from leftist to a member of the political right, and it has leftist in scare quotes. So I guess it is supposed to draw down on whether or not they were actually ever a leftist, or perhaps they're just making up these stories or something. I'm not sure what is going on with this particular sentence, but I myself can say that I had sort of a loose agglomeration of various leftist views until I started to become more honed in as to what the contradictions were, because I continually ran into contradictions. I ran into problems of trying to explain it to people, particularly here in the South where I live, who didn't understand where these views emanate from. And I saw that there were just too many errors, too many contradictions, and that's what ultimately landed me as a libertarian, because it's the one that basically chops off all of the contradictions and gets straight to clarity politically. And these contradictions are really piled up quite high when you get into economics, and when you just consider the whole concept of initiatory aggressive physical force. On page 26, it says here, this is how Dave Rubin describes his own political transformation. He frequently discusses a political awakening he had in 2014 after watching an episode of The Bill Maher Show featuring the philosopher and horseman of atheism, Sam Harris. In his appearance on the show, Sam Harris got into an argument with fellow panelist and guest Ben Affleck about contemporary Islam. You know, because there's no better expert in the world about contemporary Islam than Ben Affleck, whose real expertise seems to be getting drunk, getting divorced, being taken to rehab, things like that. In the clip, Harris criticizes modern liberalism for its unwillingness to condemn aspects of Islam. Sure, yeah, there's total cowardice there and total alignment with it. After Affleck calls these comments gross and racist, because Affleck, again, is an expert on what is gross and racist, Harris responds that we have to be able to criticize bad ideas, and that Islam at this moment is the motherlode of bad ideas. Rubin claims that after the episode was aired, the onus was put on Harris and Maher to prove that they were not bigoted, and he says the event illustrated, quote, lazy thinking on the part of progressives. The incident led to Rubin's falling out with the Young Turks, a far-left group of socialists, basically, on YouTube, after which he began producing content independently and moved more and more toward libertarianism. Yeah, that's because the left for the last 20-plus years or so has explicitly aligned itself with radical Islam. And secularists have actually been doing this for about 500 years in their alliance against Christianity overall. Then the next paragraph brings us to some true mental gymnastics. These testimonials frequently, perhaps counterintuitively, come from influencers who are women, people of color, or members of the LGBTQ community. In these cases, the influencers often reframe progressive issues of social justice into conservative narratives of individual betterment. Well, this is just the author's ideology speaking. I mean, it's counterintuitive to the author because it just does not fit the worldview. These testimonials fundamentally deny systemic oppression of vulnerable populations by positioning oppression and victimhood as a choice that can be overcome. Well, yeah, I mean, this person is setting themselves up as the expert on who is oppressed and who suffers the most, as I pointed out before. I mean, the individual is the one most likely to suffer, not these big agglomerated groups that people throw together. And there's also a systemic promotion of the capital O oppressed out there, as if it's good to be labeled as one of these victim member community people, right? It's something that is just incessantly promoted across all of the different spheres that I talked about before, the media, the universities, movies, television shows, commercials, and all that. I mean, it's good to be the one who suffers the most, or a member of a group that is said to suffer the most. And the author goes on to specifically identify the trans Blair White and the black lady Antonia Okafor for their coming out videos and the way that they basically are disgusted with SJW culture. And the author moves from there on page 27 to begin to try to associate the two previous people that I just mentioned in an attempt to blur the lines between, say, white nationalists and other people who have more extreme viewpoints, shall we say. On page 28, we find a conclusion for this particular section that says, these personalized stories are particularly powerful when they come from influencers who have built effective relationships with their audiences. Often told through highly detailed and personal narratives, these testimonials cannot be fact-checked because they speak to lived experiences. Well, wasn't it the left that first advocated that that is the way that we should do things? I think so. At the same time, they support larger narratives of racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry. Well, this is just a claim. This isn't proof. There's no evidence here, right? There's no data cited or anything. It's just claims, right? As I skip over to page 31, we find here it's saying, a number of popular videos from conservative influencers use the terms social justice, liberal, and leftist in their video titles, as well as more specific terms like intersectionality. Currently, a YouTube search for any of those terms will bring back content from conservative and libertarian political influencers within the top 10 YouTube search results. In other words, this is a call for YouTube to suppress them to at least get them off of the top 10, off of that front page. The search results for social justice, for example, include a video from PragerU entitled, What is Social Justice?, hosted by Jonah Goldberg, who is a neoconservative. He's the editor of National Review, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. They throw AEI in there because it's one that's known for being very pro-Israel, and she knows that the people who are on the left who read this basically detest Israel and everything Israel stands for. Very anti-Zionist. In the video, he echoes libertarian critiques of social justice in the format of an educational video. Other results include a video from the libertarian YouTube channel Reason TV titled Stossel, Jordan Peterson versus Social Justice Warriors, and a video from anti-SJW influencer Roaming Millennial titled Why Social Justice is Cancer. See, so she has to throw one in that's pretty extremist sounding. And basically, there's no analysis here. This is all just whining about what's on the front page or the top 10 search results. Move a bit forward onto page 32 here. Towards the bottom, it says, others generate controversy directly through their content through filmed counter-protests, which borrow from the genre of YouTube stunt videos. One prominent example is the far-right citizen journalist and activist Lauren Southern. In one instance, Southern crashed an anti-rape activist event called Slut Walk. Okay, so you're not really crashing it if you're just there to counter-protest and silently, I might add. And also, it's not much of a protest if you're walking around naked. That's rather disgraceful, and there could be children around who really don't need to be exposed to that sort of thing. if you want to protest against rape or what you call rape culture, there are much better ways to do so than walking around nude in public or calling yourself a slut. I'll jump from there to page 35, where we find Chapter 4, Facilitating Radicalization Through Social Networking. It says here towards the bottom, when libertarian and conservative influencers invite white nationalists onto their channels, they expose their audiences to alternative frameworks for understanding the world. Thus, audiences may quickly move from following influencers who criticize feminism to those promoting white nationalism. Is there any proof here? Did you hear any facts, any hard data, any evidence of anything there? Presumably, the author of this very document did observe these things and underwent no changes of their own whatsoever. So it is possible to resist, I might point out. Over the next several pages, the author spends quite a bit of space attacking Stefan Molyneux and Larry Elder. And since this video is getting rather long, I'm going to skip on ahead to page 43 with the conclusion, where basically we have a series of calls for more restrictions, more bans, more shadow banning, more regulation, more gatekeeping, more boundary policing, and so on. And this call becomes rather explicit on page 44, where it says here in the first paragraph, platforms like YouTube have an imperative to govern content and behavior for explicit values, such as the rejection of content that promotes white supremacy, regardless of whether it includes slurs. Now, I'm not sure how we began this whole thing talking about mainstream conservatives, mainstream libertarians, white nationalists, and then over here in the conclusion, we're dealing somehow with white supremacism. And also, it seems that most of this entire document is labeling everything that is non-left as some form of supremacism, which of course it is not. In the next paragraph, it also suggests that at various stages, these junctures, the platform should not only assess what channels say in their content, but also who they host and what their guests say. So if you happen to have someone on and they say something that is very concerning or disagreeable to the left, then maybe you don't get some sort of reward, or you end up getting banned, or you lose your channel entirely, and all of your many years of content and thousands upon thousands of hours poured into creating that content simply because of what someone said when they were on your show, or perhaps what someone said some other place before they actually come on your show. And finally, as you move to page 45 and beyond with the appendix, which has an index of the AIN influencers, you'll note rather quickly that several of these people are actually black men, black women, white women, LGBTQ plus people, all of these different varieties of people that the left usually says that they promote and want to support, but they don't want to support them if they're not for the political left. You see, so it's far more about political ideology than it is about any of these other categories that they pretend that they care about so much. And really what our ultimate conclusion can be about this third entry out of the 4 articles that I plan to be covering here is basically a hot house of left-wing conspiracy theorizing. There's just loads and loads of conspiracy theories about what is actually taking place and how dangerous it is for people to talk to one another directly rather than through the mainstream media and its gatekeeperism. The ultimate goal here for them is to create a series of target lists so that ultimately these people can be banned or shadow banned, to lose their channels, lose their social media access, and then to attempt to set up algorithmic parameters in order to block anyone similar from rising up later on. So the next and final entry in this process is going to be the Atlantic Council's Whose Truth, Sovereignty, Disinformation, and Winning the Battle of Trust. And that one sort of sets a larger parameter way of viewing this whole thing through the lens of the elite and what it is they ultimately plan to do overall. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.